Brielle's heartbeat thudded in her chest, but she kept her composure. The sting of Jason's words gnawed at her, familiar yet still sharp. She knew all too well how racism slithered through casual remarks like Jason's, designed to undermine and isolate. But today was different. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. Conversations dwindled, heads turned toward her. Jason's cocky grin faltered ever so slightly, though he masked it with a smirk. "You think my skin's a joke?" Brielle's voice was steady, louder than the cafeteria's hum. "You really think that saying stuff like that makes you better?" The cafeteria was deathly silent. Even the football players at the far end of the room were paying attention now. Brielle's warm brown eyes held Jason's, unflinching. "I love my skin," she said firmly. "It tells stories your shallow mind could never understand. And just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean I'll apologize for being who I am." Mia shifted awkwardly, her smirk gone, replaced by guilt. A couple of students whispered to each other, unsure of what to do next. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but for once, words failed him. "Brielle's right." A voice broke through the silence. It was Serena, one of the theater kids, her voice carrying confidence. "We all see what you're doing, Jason. And it's not cool. It's racist." Several others nodded, murmurs rippling across the room. Brielle felt a strange warmth settle over her, the weight of isolation lifting ever so slightly. Jason's face reddened. "Whatever," he muttered, pushing back from the table and stomping out of the cafeteria. His friends awkwardly followed, their bravado crumbling. As Brielle sat down, Serena walked over with a soft smile. "You handled that perfectly," she said. "Thanks," Brielle replied, still catching her breath. In the days that followed, the cafeteria incident sparked something bigger. Teachers and students began discussing racism openly, something that had always simmered just under the surface at Roosevelt High. A student-led diversity council formed, with Brielle as one of its founding members. Brielle's stand became more than a fleeting moment. It was a spark, igniting a wave of change that swept through the school. And though not everything changed overnight, Brielle knew that standing tall against racism, even when it was hard, had made a difference. Brielle's steady gaze didn't waver as the room hung in silence. Jason shifted uncomfortably. The bravado he had clung to slowly peeling away. Mia looked down at her tray, guilt painted across her face. "You think I'll shrink from your words?" Brielle said, her voice unwavering. "Let me be clear, I won't. Not today. Not ever." The cafeteria was still, as though frozen in time. Brielle's presence filled the space, bold and unapologetic. She could feel eyes on her, but the weight of their attention no longer felt suffocating. It was fuel. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but Brielle didn't give him the chance. "You want to talk about honesty?" she pressed. "Here's some for you. Racism isn't a personality trait. It's cowardice wrapped in cruelty. You hide behind cheap insults to make yourself feel powerful. But guess what? It doesn't work on me." The words echoed through the room, reverberating off walls that had absorbed too many unspoken truths. A few students murmured in agreement. Serena, sitting with her theater friends, nodded silently. Even some of Jason's own friends looked unsure now, their smug expressions gone. One of the lunch monitors took a tentative step forward, ready to intervene, but hesitated when Brielle glanced their way, her calm demeanor signaling she had this under control. Jason's face flushed red, his confidence faltering. "You're being dramatic," he muttered. "No, I'm being real," Brielle corrected, "and it's about time this school got a dose of that." Her words hung in the air, unchallenged. As Brielle returned to her seat, something remarkable happened. Serena stood up and clapped. At first it was just one person, but soon others joined in, the sound swelling into a wave of support. Jason and his crew slinked out of the cafeteria, their exit marked not by triumph, but by defeat. When Brielle sat down, a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't just defended herself, she had spoken up for every student who had ever been made to feel small because of their race or identity. From that day forward, Roosevelt High started to change. Brielle's courage ignited conversations that were long overdue. Students who had once stayed silent found their voices. The school began hosting forums on diversity and inclusivity, and Brielle became a key leader in those efforts. And though Jason's words had once cut deep, Brielle knew she had turned those wounds into strength. She had stood tall against racism, and the echoes of her stand would carry on long after the lunch bell rang. Brielle's words hung in the air like a challenge no one dared to dismiss. Jason shifted uncomfortably, the cracks in his confidence fully exposed. For once, he wasn't the one controlling the room. "You hear that, Jason?" Brielle's voice remained steady, but its edge was undeniable. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you and people like you think you can tear down, but you can't break what's built on strength." The silence was thick, heavy with realization. Students who had once pretended not to notice Jason's remarks now watched with newfound respect for Brielle. "You think my black skin makes me a target?" Brielle continued, her words resolute. "But what it really makes me is unstoppable. Strong, whole, and I don't need your validation for that." Jason's gaze darted around the cafeteria, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. His friends looked away, embarrassed. Even Mia, who usually thrived on Jason's antics, sat with his shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact. A slow murmur rippled through the room, growing louder as more students nodded in agreement. The oppressive weight of Jason's influence was beginning to lift, replaced by something Brielle hadn't anticipated: solidarity. Mia stood up suddenly, her face pale but determined. "She's right," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "This whole thing is messed up. We've been letting it slide for too long." Jason glared at her, but she didn't back down. "It's not cool. Not anymore." The murmur turned into a chorus of agreement, like a collective exhale after holding breath for too long. One by one, students voiced their support. Brielle felt a wave of relief wash over her, not just for herself, but for every kid who had ever been made to feel less because of their race, their identity, or their differences. Jason stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "Whatever," he muttered, storming out of the cafeteria, his bravado crumbling into dust. As he disappeared through the double doors, Brielle exhaled deeply and returned to her seat. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was a newfound steadiness in her heart. Serena walked over, her eyes shining with admiration. "That was incredible," she said softly. "Thanks," Brielle replied, her voice calmer now. "It had to be said." And it was only the beginning. Word spread quickly through the school, and Brielle's bold stand sparked real conversations about racism and respect. Teachers began facilitating discussions, and students who had once stayed silent found their voices. Brielle's courage had shattered the walls of indifference, making room for change. The echoes of her words lingered long after the cafeteria had emptied, a testament to the power of speaking up and standing proud. The claps grew louder, spreading like waves across the cafeteria. Brielle stood in the center, calm and grounded, not basking in the applause but strengthened by it. It was never about winning attention, it was about taking back her power and breaking the silence around the casual racism that had lingered far too long. Jason's face remained flushed, his cocky demeanor reduced to silence. The swagger he usually wore like armor had shattered completely. Even his friends, who once laughed along with his jokes, sat quietly, unsure of where to look. Mia fidgeted in her seat, her expression wavering between guilt and discomfort. She opened her mouth as if to say something but quickly shut it, her gaze fixed on her tray. Brielle returned to her table, her steps measured and deliberate. The echoes of her stand hung in the air like a new rhythm the school was just learning to hear. "Brielle, that was brave," Serena said softly as she approached, admiration shining in her eyes. "Yeah, seriously," added Marcus, one of the quieter students who usually kept his head down. "It needed to be said." Brielle offered a small nod. "Thanks," she said simply, appreciating their support, but knowing this wasn't just her victory. It was a step forward for everyone who had ever stayed silent. The cafeteria began to hum with voices again, but the energy had shifted. Conversations carried a different weight now, filled with reflection instead of indifference. As Brielle sat down, another student, a shy sophomore with curly hair, gave her a timid smile from across the room. Brielle smiled back, realizing that courage had a ripple effect. It inspired others to stand a little taller, too. Just as she picked up her fork, Principal Keller entered the cafeteria, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her expression was stern but thoughtful as she scanned the room, clearly aware that something significant had just unfolded. She made her way to Brielle's table, stopping just in front of her. "Brielle," the principal said, her tone even, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Brielle's heart raced slightly, but she met Principal Keller's gaze without flinching. "Sure," she said, standing up once more. The two walked toward the cafeteria doors, the eyes of curious students following them. Brielle didn't know what awaited her in that conversation, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't regret speaking her truth. The cafeteria had returned to its usual rhythm: laughter, conversations, the clatter of trays, but something intangible lingered in the air, a shift in the school's unspoken rules. Brielle's stand had left a mark, one that couldn't easily be erased. Jason sat alone, staring down at his half-eaten lunch. His friends had scattered, their loyalty fading the moment things got uncomfortable. His shoulders were hunched, the weight of his isolation pressing down on him. Brielle took a steadying breath, willing the tremble in her hands to disappear. The adrenaline from her confrontation still coursed through her, but she kept her expression composed. Heroes didn't always get a moment to rest, but they had to keep moving forward. Serena leaned over from across the table. "That was legendary," she whispered. "I don't think Jason will ever recover." Brielle gave a small smile. "It's not about that," she said softly. "It's about making sure people think twice before saying stuff like that again." As if on cue, a sophomore boy with thick glasses approached nervously. "Thanks for what you said," he murmured, barely meeting her eyes. It meant a lot." Brielle's heart softened. "I'm glad," she replied. "You don't have to stay quiet, you know. None of us do." The boy nodded shyly before returning to his table. Across the room, Mia hovered by the trash cans, her expression torn. She glanced at Brielle, guilt flickering in her eyes, but said nothing as she hurried toward the exit. Brielle didn't dwell on it. People changed at their own pace, if they chose to change at all. As the lunch period neared its end, Principal Keller's voice crackled over the intercom. "Attention Roosevelt High students. I'd like to remind everyone that respect and inclusivity are not just ideals, they're expectations. Let's continue to make this school a place where everyone belongs." Brielle smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that day, whispers had already turned into conversations. Teachers nodded approvingly at Brielle in the hallways, and students who had never spoken to her before offered smiles and quiet words of support. Jason remained subdued, his usual bravado gone. Whether he'd truly change was uncertain, but Brielle knew one thing for sure. She had shattered the silence that once protected people like him. As she walked to her next class, the sun streaming through the windows, Brielle felt lighter. She wasn't just a black girl trying to navigate a predominantly white school anymore. She was a voice, a force, a hero of her own story. By the next day, Roosevelt High buzzed with the echoes of Brielle's stand in the cafeteria. The incident spread like wildfire, twisting with each retelling. "Did you hear how Brielle shut Jason down?" one student whispered near the lockers. "I didn't know she had it in her," another added, wide-eyed. Some admired her courage while others dismissed it as unnecessary drama. Still, Brielle walked through the crowded hallways with her head held high, refusing to be defined by gossip or opinions. Her classes, however, reflected a subtle but profound shift. Conversations that were once mundane now carried weight. In English, a boy raised his hand unexpectedly. "Why do people feel the need to tear others down? Is it jealousy or insecurity?" The teacher blinked in surprise before steering the class into a deep discussion about prejudice and the fear of differences. Brielle remained quiet, absorbing the dialogue. She noticed classmates grappling with their thoughts, some shifting uncomfortably while others spoke with newfound conviction. At lunch, Jason sat alone, his bravado stripped away. His friends had scattered, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. Brielle felt a fleeting pang of pity, but reminded herself that this was a consequence of his choices. Whether he learned from it was up to him. Later that week, as Brielle gathered her books from her locker, she heard hesitant footsteps, approaching. Turning, she saw Mia, the last person she expected to face. Mia's usual confidence was gone, replaced by visible nerves. Her fingers twisted the strap of her backpack. "Hey, Brielle," she said quietly. Brielle raised an eyebrow, keeping her tone neutral. "What's up?" Mia hesitated, then blurted, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For laughing. For not stopping him. I don't know what I thought. But it wasn't right." For a moment, Brielle didn't know how to respond. Apologies weren't common in situations like this. She studied Mia's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. All she saw was guilt and genuine regret. "Thank you," Brielle said, her voice steady but kind. Mia nodded, relieved. "It won't happen again, I promise." "We'll see," Brielle replied, her lips curving into a small smile. As Mia walked away, Brielle felt a weight lift. She had taken a stand, and the echoes of her voice were still being felt. Later that afternoon, a group of students gathered near the school mural, discussing how they could create a club focused on inclusivity and respect. Brielle was invited to join. Walking home under the warm Cincinnati sun, Brielle realized something profound. This wasn't just about one cafeteria showdown. It was about sparking conversations that had been buried for too long. Brielle smiled at Taylor's words, the warmth in her chest growing stronger. "I guess," she said softly. "It's weird, though. I didn't think anything would come of it. I was just tired." Taylor nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, but that's the thing. You never know who's listening when you speak up." Brielle gazed out the window again, watching the golden leaves drift from the trees. The cafeteria hummed with the usual noise of laughter and conversation, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. She thought back to the quiet words of support from classmates she'd never spoken to before, to Mia's sincere apology, and to the way teachers had woven conversations about respect and understanding into their lessons. The principal's announcement over the intercom had surprised everyone, but it cemented the fact that Roosevelt High was paying attention. It wasn't perfect, Brielle knew that. There were still the occasional stares and whispered comments. But the weight she'd carried for so long had lightened. Jason, once the center of so much attention, had faded into the background. His swagger was gone, replaced by a subdued demeanor. He avoided Brielle entirely. and while he never apologized, his silence spoke volumes. Taylor's voice pulled Brielle from her thoughts. "So, what's next for our resident superhero?" she teased, grinning. Brielle laughed, shaking her head. "I'm no superhero, Tay." "You are to a lot of people," Taylor said, her tone sincere. "You made people think, Bri. That's powerful." Brielle's smile softened. "I just want things to be better, you know, for everyone." "And they will be," Taylor said confidently. "One step at a time." As they sat there, the cafeteria bustling around them, Brielle felt a sense of peace. She had spoken up, and people had listened. Maybe not everyone, but enough. And that was how change started. One voice, one conversation, one moment at a time. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Brielle gathered her things, standing up with Taylor, as they made their way to the exit. A few students nodded at Brielle in passing, their expressions warm and respectful. She didn't need validation, but it felt good to know she wasn't invisible anymore. As they walked toward their next class, Brielle glanced at Taylor. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "Maybe I'll get a cape next time." Taylor burst out laughing. "Oh, absolutely, you'd rock it." Brielle grinned, the weight she'd carried for so long finally lifting. Brielle stood up, her gaze sweeping across the cafeteria. The room was still chaotic, still loud, still filled with the usual cliques. But something had shifted. The divisions felt less rigid, the atmosphere more aware, as if the invisible walls between groups had started to crack. Maybe she hadn't changed the world, but she had sparked something. And that was enough for now. She picked up her tray, her steps steady and sure as she headed for the exit. The whispers and sidelong glances that had once chipped away at her confidence no longer fazed her. She had reclaimed her own voice, and with it, her space in the world. Before reaching the doors, Brielle glanced back at Jason's usual table, now occupied by another group of students. He wasn't there. For the first time, the sight didn't stir anger or unease, only peace. Standing up for yourself wasn't easy, Brielle knew that. But it was one of the most powerful things you could do, and the ripple effect of her choice was already unfolding. In conversations sparked in classrooms, in quiet apologies, in the way people nodded at her with newfound respect.